Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Vintage Books Live. I'm Christy Peterson from Vintage Books, and tonight we're really pleased to have Sarah L. Sanderson with us. Sarah is the author of The Place We Make. It is a nonfiction book that came out just a few weeks ago.
Few months ago.
Few months
Yeah.
ago. And actually, it was one of our vintage books friends who brought the book to our attention and said, "Hey, I know this person and she's written this really cool book." And we said, "Oh, yay. Yes, we want that book and we want to talk to her." So I'm super excited to have her here. Do you happen to have a copy of the book?
I sure do.
Hi.
Yes. Even has a little post-it note hanging out of
Yay.
it.
Thank you so much. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm at home when I do these, so I don't have the books to show. But
Yeah.
Um, I am just going to jump right in and ask you to talk a little bit first about what the book's about, and then a little bit about how you came to
hmm
talk about this
hmm
topic and how you came to write this book.
Yeah. So the book kind of tells two stories. One is the story of what happened in Oregon City in 1851. A man named Jacob Vanderpool became the only person to be actually expelled from Oregon because he was Black. So that's one kind of trajectory that the book takes, is telling that story. And then the other part is that the book gets into my own sort of racialized development as a white person living for some part of my life in Oregon. I was born here and left and came back again. Um, and so just looking at basically the legacy of that law, that case, like Oregon was the only state to join the Union with an anti-Black exclusion law on its books. And up there in Vancouver, you guys don't get out totally of this conversation because when the law was first written, you were part of the Oregon Territory as well. So the law covered Washington and Oregon. Um, and so the how I came to write this book was when I moved back to Oregon as an adult after being here and leaving and coming back again. It was really coming back here as an adult that I realized just how white it is demographically here in Oregon compared to other places that I'd lived in Minneapolis and New Jersey and Chicago, places like that. Um, and I didn't know what the history was. I didn't know why. And I happened to have a conversation with my brother, and he said, "Didn't you know that Oregon had this law in the books?" And I was like, "No, I had no idea." And so I just started Googling, and I wasn't intending to write a book. I just wanted to learn more. And I came across Jacob Vanderpool's name and started researching. And in the course of my research, I ended up discovering that I have not one, but two ancestors who both were living in Oregon City at that time and who played roles in the case. One actively and one sort of passively as a bystander. And so what that did was it brought the story from just like, oh, this crazy thing that happened a long time ago to, oh, this is personal. This is my family. This is my history. And so then it motivated me to do some more digging of like not just what's out there, but what's in here and how did what's in here get there.
Yeah.
And then really the book is it's a lament. It's a an attempt to sort of name and confess and kind of work my way towards what would it look like to begin to try to help repair some of these things.
Yeah.
So,
What what were some of the things, I guess some of the I don't know what to call them. I mean, the best word I can think of is stages, because I think I can identify in myself realizations about the reality of racism in this country
yeah.
and how it's not as fixed as
hmm
I maybe
hmm
grew up believing that it was.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm curious, what were some of the stages that you sort of went through as a
hmm
person as you're kind of coming to terms with some of that?
Yeah. Yeah. Um, Well, first of all, let me say that I definitely have not arrived at the expert
Yeah.
stage, right? Like I really wrote the book in an attempt to say to readers like, hey, I'm just like barely starting out on
Yeah.
this journey. Would you like to come with me?
Yeah.
Um, but really I say part of it began when I moved back to Oregon as an adult, but another part of this awareness in me really started when I was in college. I had the opportunity to take a trip to Africa, to Malawi in East Africa. And while I was there, I sort of realized for the first time that there were some prejudices swimming around in me that I hadn't realized were there. So I think that was the first stage, was just realizing like
Yeah.
something's in me that I didn't want to be there. I don't know how it got there, but it's there. And then the next stage was trying to figure out how to talk about it and coming up against other people's disapproval and entering a stage of shame. Like, I mean, there was some shame when I first realized it, but then
Right.
when I started to try to talk about it, there was even more shame. Like, oh my goodness, I don't think I'm even supposed to admit that this is
Yeah.
here.
Yeah.
And I stayed there for a long time. Sorry, losing my, high budget earpiece here. Um, and then, um, and then it was, like I say, coming to Oregon, realizing that there was a history, that it wasn't just like I woke up and realized there was something in me that I don't know where it came from and it's bad.
Yeah.
But realizing, like, oh, if I look back and see these hundreds of years of history, then that helps explain what's going
Right.
on inside me.
Yeah.
And not that it excuses it or makes it okay, but it helped me to understand where it came
Yeah.
from.
Yeah.
So digging into the history, um, and then just getting comfortable with trying again, like to talk about it.
Yeah.
And I had a friend who, she runs an anti-racism group. And I remember when I was just starting to think about like, okay, I'm doing this research. What if I started actually try to write about it? And I was really afraid, like, oh my gosh, is
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
okay for me to write? And she said, well, my goal for white people is always that they'll hopefully begin to identify some of their own racism. Not that like all white people are
Yeah.
racist, but
Yeah.
just like, can we even ask ourselves
Yeah.
if that's a word that might apply in some situations?
Right.
And when I heard her verbalize that, it was like, oh, okay, like
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
that's a that's something that she can say out loud, and I can we can have a conversation.
Yeah.
So just
Yeah.
practicing, like, what does it feel like to have this conversation? When George Floyd was killed and that whole conversation exploded, then that was sort of accelerated my thinking of like,
Right.
I just need to listen, pay attention to what's happening.
Mhm.
Um, and then the stage that I hope I'm sort of coming into is figuring out, okay, where do I go from here? Like I've
Yeah.
tried to do all this
Yeah.
work of like identifying and get comfortable with just having this conversation. And now what? So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. No, that I see a lot of parallels for myself too, is I grew up in Central Washington and I hadn't really thought of it until I
Yeah.
was looking at um doing the interview with you and stuff. But
Mm,
I think it extends up into Washington.
mm-hmm.
Um, and I didn't realize the law was predated the Oregon state, like
Yeah.
predated the statehood stuff, so that Washington was still included in that because we were
Mm-hmm.
part of Oregon territory. But there are not very many Black people in the Yakima Valley.
Yeah.
There's a lot of racism
Mm-hmm.
because there are people of Latino descent and there are indigenous people in
Yeah.
but there's not. It was interesting that Black people were treated as more of a novelty
Mm.
And
Hmm.
that's a form of racism in and of itself in
Yeah.
retrospect. But
Hmm.
growing up, I don't think I was really cognizant of that,
Yeah.
because a novelty and being cool
Hmm.
feels like a positive thing.
Hmm.
In
Hmm.
retrospect, being called out as a exotic thing is
Right.
not good either. Not
Right.
it's just as racist as all the
Right.
rest of it. But as a kid, I didn't really recognize that. So I never really thought of myself as racist because of also just being very tuned into the racism that was there against some of these other
Mm.
groups and really
Hmm.
trying to work against that. I think if you're at all in the space of, well, I try to combat racism, therefore I can't be racist.
Hmm.
And so I grew up just
Yeah.
thinking of myself in those terms and then having to come to terms with, and mostly through facing down the one story after another,
Hmm.
the
Hmm.
police
Hmm.
brutality,
Yeah.
of realizing, hey, wait a minute, this
Yeah.
something's wrong here,
Yeah.
because the first few times you hear about it, you're like, oh, well, we weren't there and we don't know what
Right.
really happened. But then there starts to be this pattern, and then you kind of have to really address within yourself of, wait a minute, and I think the other thing that we get so defensive because we think, well, I'm not racist, but we don't really see that it's kind of baked into how
Hmm.
everything works. And
Hmm.
so
Yeah.
whether we are not personally, we're participating in a system that is.
Right.
And I think that that's another huge realization on my journey was,
Hmm.
oh, well, yeah, but if you grow up and the system's rigged against you,
Hmm.
that's a form of racism. And so, yeah, I think it's interesting to see those journeys come out, and it is interesting to see how easy it is to kind of fall into the, oh, I can't do anything about it,
Hmm. Hmm.
and
Yeah.
that's frustrating and hard.
Yeah.
But I mean, we've talked about a little bit about the legacies of the Oregon law. Can you talk a little bit specifically about what that law was and remind us like when the date that it went
Yeah.
into
Yeah.
effect?
So there were actually three different laws, and I'm glad you brought up the presence of Indigenous people in this region because that, interestingly, kind of sparked the initial law.
Oh, interesting.
Before we get to Jacob Vanderpool's case, there was a man named, I'm blanking on his first name, but Sauls was his last name. He was a black man and he was living with a Chinook woman. And there was a settler who was coming in to take, some land, as everybody was doing back then, like you come to Oregon and you get your free 160 acres of land. And he signed up for some land that had some indigenous people living on it. Or not, sorry, not Saul's. Some white pioneer came in, signed up for some land. I think his name is James. James Sauls and his Chinook wife decide to side with, he says, I'm going to side with the Indians and I'm going to help protect my wife's family from this person who's come in to settle here. And they locked him up. And immediately after this trial against this particular Black person, the superintendent of Indian Affairs writes to Congress in Washington, D.C. and says, can we get some relief? Can we legally prohibit the immigration of Black people because they're dangerous, because they're siding with the indigenous people, and we can't have that. So it was that alliance that sparks
Interesting.
the first law. So the first law goes into effect in 1844, and it just said, um, you can't be here if you're Black, basically. And it also said if people are brought to Oregon who are enslaved, their enslavers have 3 years to release them. So effectively legalizing slavery in Oregon for 3 years.
Oh,
And yeah,
interesting.
I know a lot of people don't realize that. And if they don't leave before the end of the 3 years, we will whip them 39 times because 40 was considered fatal. So that was called the Lash Law. There's no evidence that the Lash Law was ever used, but we don't know.
Mm.
So then a few years later, they decided that was too harsh. And in 1849, they tried again. They said, okay, we're going to make it's illegal to come, reside, or be within the state of Oregon if you're Black. And then in 1857, um, which is when Oregon was coming up for statehood. I think we legally, officially became a state in 1859, but they wrote the Constitution in
Yeah.
1857. So I'll read it to you. It's just in the front of the book. This was the law that was voted on by Oregonians in 1857. No free Negro or mulatto not residing in this state at the time of the adoption of this Constitution shall come, reside, or be within this state, or hold any real estate, or make any contracts, or maintain any suit therein. And the Legislative Assembly shall provide by penal laws for the removal by public officers of all such Negroes and mulattoes, and for their effectual exclusion from the state, and for the punishment of persons who shall bring them into the state, or employ or harbor them.
Uh,
Yeah, it's like,
well, it has it's like you have this I have this visceral reaction to it, but what I thought was really interesting is it might even be on that same page. Is that
yeah.
same page the one you put the little quote at the bottom? I
Hmm.
took a picture of it and then my picture is really blurry. Could you read that little
Yes.
quote as well?
Yeah. So this is Walida Imarisha. She's a professor at, I think, PSU right now. Um, and she says the only thing about Oregon that is unique is that they were bold enough to write it down.
Yeah.
So
And
not
so
that
I think
Oregon
that,
has, yeah,
yeah.
like a
I
corner
just think
on, yeah,
that was just a pretty powerful way of saying it because you can look at Oregon and say, oh my gosh, that's so horrible. How could they do that? But I mean, there's not Washington is not all that dissimilar. I mean,
yeah,
our Black population is not huge either. It's
yeah,
not, it's a part of our culture and it's part of our history, but not in the way that it should have been,
yeah,
really.
yeah,
It's if you were looking at demographics of the country and if
yeah.
equal opportunity had been in place,
Hmm.
there would have been a lot more
Yeah,
diversity in both Oregon and Washington than there is right now.
yeah.
Um, how I'm just trying to think how to formulate a question, but I'm just thinking about the contrast and that quote and the being bold enough to write it down. Um, and we don't think of the West as being particularly racist, right?
Hmm.
Like
Hmm.
if we think about racism, we almost automatically like think of the South.
Yeah.
Um, but it feels like we were in a way just racist in a different way.
Hmm.
It's like
Hmm.
exclude people from coming. How, if Oregon was the one that was bold enough to write it down, how did you see that playing out? I don't know if you had an opportunity to look at it a little bit as far as other Western states, and how did that play out elsewhere, even if it wasn't
Yeah.
written?
So interestingly, like the genesis of it, why they didn't want Black people here in the Pacific Northwest was because if you think about who came over on the Oregon Trail, they were not wealthy by and large, right?
Right.
If you had land and money and property, you weren't going to risk your
Mhm.
life putting all your possessions in a covered wagon,
Yeah,
right? So it was poorer people. They weren't people who, by and mostly, they hadn't been enslaving people in the
right,
places where they came from. So they didn't have people to bring with them in that way. But they also, where they had come from, they felt at a disadvantage because of the economic machine of slavery.
right.
So they were looking at their neighbors and saying, like, we don't want that because it made us feel like we could never get ahead. So there's somebody I quote in here, one of the early pioneers. He says, "I'm going to Oregon where there'll be no slaves and we'll all start even." So that was where it kind of came from, was like,
Yeah.
we just want to start off evenly. Um, and then, so what happened with Washington was there was a man named George Washington Bush, which is such a great American
Yeah.
name,
Yeah.
who was a black wagon train leader, came on the Oregon Trail, heard about the Oregon exclusion law, turned north, became the first settler in the Puget Sound region.
Yeah. Yeah. That
Um,
I'm vaguely
yeah,
familiar with.
yeah.
So yeah.
So then what happened was later, when the boundary changed of the Oregon Territory, all of a sudden he was included in this region that now is covered by that anti-Black exclusion law. And they did press charges against him and found that he was guilty of breaking the law. But his neighbors rallied around him and they wrote to Congress and said, we don't want this person to leave. And Congress wrote a law. It's called something like an act of relief specifically and exclusively for George Washington Bush.
Interesting.
So they're like, okay, you can have that one, right?
Interesting.
Um, yeah.
Interesting.
So I mean, I think that the law did shape, who came and who
Yeah.
didn't
Yeah.
come. Another, it's like tied to our neighbors to the south. Peter Burnett, the man who wrote the very first exclusion law, ended up becoming the first governor of California.
Uh-huh.
So, yes, there's like,
Yeah. Yeah.
and I
All up
don't
and down
know
the
all of
coast.
the history. I'm sure,
Yeah. Yeah.
other people could
Well,
say more,
but
but
I think of the Western states in general, and this is from a place of not being completely informed. So if no one, you don't hold me to it, but put in the comments if
yeah.
I'm wrong, or if you're watching this from one of the other states. But I think about the demographics of, say, Idaho, Montana,
hmm
Nevada,
hmm
Colorado,
hmm Yeah.
even New Mexico and Arizona. Like, I don't think that the populations there of people from a Black cultural background are very high either. I mean, it's not that people
Yeah.
aren't there and they aren't
Yeah.
part of the community and contributing
Yeah.
now, but back, 100 years ago or so, I don't think that that was, I mean, they weren't getting to go in other places as much either, I don't think,
Right.
although someone could definitely say, no, my town did allow, you know what I mean?
Right.
And
Right.
because I don't have a lot of, but I don't feel like us as a West,
Yeah.
it's particularly diverse in that specific area, regardless
Yeah.
of where you go.
Yeah. And there's so many reasons for that, right? I mean,
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
like this law is part of it, but of course
right,
there's also
right,
sundown towns and redlining
right,
and,
right.
I mean, so many things.
Well,
So,
and just having the capacity to let go,
hmm
even though the people that went on the Oregon Trail weren't particularly wealthy and often came because were at an economic disadvantage. They still had to have enough resources to, buy their wagon, buy
right,
their
right.
oxen,
All those
and
things.
that's not something that would have been possible
Yeah.
for most Black people in that era anyway, because you're just you're post slavery and
Well, and
um
even pre, I mean, the Oregon Trail
yeah,
is really in the
yeah,
40s. So
right,
slavery is still
right,
happening. Yeah.
yeah. So I thought it was interesting, though, the quote that you were talking about, where they said they wanted to have everybody start equally, except that everybody is
Right. It's
all the white
just
people
us. Yeah.
starting. So yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
I mean, isn't that the like paradox of America, right? Like
yeah,
we say liberty and justice for
yeah.
all, and then all is very particularly
Right,
defined.
right. And I think it's fascinating how we're wrestling today still with the legacy of slavery, with the legacy of these kinds of laws and whatnot, just on the, I think, even we've talked about this a few minutes ago. I mean, even those of us who want it to be
Mhm.
different
Mm,
are having to come to terms with the fact that we are still inherently at an advantage,
mhm.
um, even if it's just skin color, like we're
Yeah.
still at an advantage when we walk into a store or where we
hmm
do all kinds of
hmm
other things. Um, and then of course we're wrestling with a lot of other new forms of
Yeah.
um, racism and other kinds of isms. But One thing that I was really curious about, just like this is a very micro fact question, but the man that was in the trial that was
Mm-hmm.
convicted and excluded, do we
Yeah.
know where he went after and what happened to him?
So that's why you need to read the book.
Okay. Well, maybe I
Yeah.
shouldn't let you answer that question. You have to answer.
Yeah, no. So when I got this book contract and I sat down and talked to my editor, he said, "I want you to find his descendants." And I'm like, "Well, I don't know if I'm
Um,
going to be able to do that."
yeah,
So,
that's a
like,
challenge.
am I just going to like look up everybody in the phone book of every? I mean, we don't even have phone books anymore, right?
Yeah.
Like, just Google
Yeah.
the last name and like, I don't know.
Yeah.
So I did not find his descendants, but I was able to figure out. No, I'll just tell you, but you still
Okay.
should read
You
the book.
still should read the book.
Yeah. So that was a big part of my research was to try to figure out what happened to this man. And what I ended up finding out through the help of a group called Oregon Black Pioneers, who
Mm.
had a leg up on some of the research, um, is that so when he came to Oregon, he had left a wife and three small children in New York. And I believe that he most likely intended to settle himself and then bring them out. So he had a wife and twin 3-year-old daughters and a newborn son whom he had not met yet when he left for Oregon. You know, and then so Oregon Black Pioneers helped me figure out that much, and then I was trying to figure out like, but did he ever go back? And I was like looking and looking on Ancestry and census records and different things. I finally found on a tax record in the 1870s, I think. There's just this one line. Um, he and his son were paying taxes for basically driving taxi cabs, like horse-drawn
Oh, okay.
carriages in New
Yeah.
York
Yeah.
City. So like he went back, like that one
Yeah.
line
Yeah.
let me know that. And then like in the next decade, he ends up in California, and he the last thing he does before before there are no more records of him is he was able to register to vote after the 15th
Cool.
Amendment was passed in California. So, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and the hard thing is just I mean, and I know this is hard and heartbreaking for a lot of Black people trying to do
Yeah.
ancestry research is, people took their names from different places. And so
Mhm.
what is it, what was it,
Vanderpool.
Yeah. And Vanderpool, of course, I mean, I immediately think of like Dutch,
Dutch. Yeah.
Vander, and
And
so,
so
and I'm so
he was
I'm sure you
considered.
had all these people
Yeah.
coming up that don't have any relation whatsoever. And
Right. Yeah. I'm like, I don't even know if these Vanderpools are black or white, or
yeah,
if his even descendants today would consider themselves black or white. I mean, who knows?
right, exactly.
But he was born in the Dutch West Indies, and he was considered mulatto in the court documents. So I think he probably did have a white Dutch father, most likely, and a
Yeah.
enslaved African mother.
Um, what happened to those laws? Were they directly repealed at any point, or were they just kind of those laws
Uh,
that sort of are on the books but fade off and never actually come off?
so in 1926, which is in my grandmother's lifetime,
Yeah, mine too.
yeah,
Yeah.
they 62% of the Oregon population voted to remove the law from the books.
Interesting.
So even at that time, you still have a lot of
Yeah.
people who are voting, no, we
Yeah.
still
Yeah.
want this
I mean,
law.
62 is yay, but that means,
Yeah,
38 or whatever. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And then if you think about that time in the 1920s, Oregon was the site of the largest Ku Klux Klan west of the
Yeah.
Mississippi
Yeah.
River. So, it was in the heat of all that
Yeah.
too.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. No, and there is an author, a fiction author named Kat Winters that has a
Hmm,
book, that is the YA book that's centered around that time that I
hmm,
have read. And so,
hmm.
of course, none of it's like the people aren't real, but the
Yeah,
circumstances and stuff are. And
yeah,
yeah, there's just like to be Black in Oregon, like I mean, even now has this tenuous balance of any person of color living
Yeah.
in the US. But to be Black in Oregon at that time was really perilous because it really depended on the people around you whether you were safe or
Yeah.
not.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think of the differences between Bush and Vanderpool, who
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
one of them had his community around them saying, heck no, you're not gonna,
Yeah.
mess with our guy. And then somebody else who doesn't have that is
Right.
just,
Right. Yeah. And that's where looking at my own family members came in because so on the one side, and they're not direct ancestors, but they're like,
yeah,
cousins
yeah,
or whatever. So the guy who pressed charges against Jacob Vanderpool is a cousin of mine on my dad's side. And then the other person that I look at on my mom's side, I'm related to a man who was a pastor and professor in Oregon City, so like leader in the community, and he, does nothing, does
yeah,
not
yeah,
rally the community to save him. And so looking at those twin legacies of actively trying to make this a white
yeah,
only
yeah,
place and passively kind of saying like, oh well, there's nothing we can do.
yeah,
And so then to look at my own self and like, where do I participate actively in
yeah,
being exclusionary, or where do I passively silently
yeah,
just go like,
yeah.
oh well, this thing is happening, there's nothing I can do. So
Yeah, and I think honestly, I don't remember the exact quote from Martin Luther King Jr., but talking about sort
mhm.
of the moderate person who doesn't want to rock the boat is actually being more hurtful and problematic than the person who is like openly
Yeah,
racist because you're sitting back and letting it happen and you're not
yeah,
doing anything.
yeah.
And I think I definitely have a tendency, like I don't like to be confrontational and
Mhm.
stuff. And I think that's one of the things I've had to wrestle with in my own life of,
Yeah,
okay, but what are you gonna do about it?
yeah, yeah.
And
And it's scary to talk
yeah,
about this
for
stuff
sure.
as a white person. I mean, about 6 months before my book came out, there was a book that came out. It was a white woman writing a book about race, and the cover of the book, like she just got ripped to shreds on Twitter.
Yeah.
Like,
I think I
how
know who
dare
you're
this
talking about.
person? Yeah.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
I just watched it. I was like, oh, please don't let that be me,
yeah, yeah. But I think
And
there's a difference
yeah,
between talking about a story that's not yours and owning the story that is yours.
yeah,
And I
yeah.
think when we write about our role in it, then it is our story. And
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
but
Yeah, that's what I tried to do and tried to do as much, reading and listening and talking to people as I could, and also just to get people of color eyes on the book and just
yeah,
say like, is
make
this
sure I didn't
working?
really
Yeah.
miss it. I've
And
had a few times where I've needed to do that too. Of,
yeah,
okay, I've
yeah.
said these things. Can someone please tell me if I've
Right.
like made this
Right.
giant faux pas?
Right. And
But where do you see the legacy? Like, I mean, we've sort of vaguely alluded to this all through the whole interview, but where do you see the legacy of those laws, like most profoundly when you're in your life or being in Oregon or Southwest Washington or
yeah. I mean, I think so much of it is just still the demographics. And it's just what we've been talking about, right? Like the sort of assumption that we don't have to think about this or deal with
yeah,
this
yeah,
because like, well, everybody's just white here. So like
yeah,
there's no
yeah,
problem, right? Like
yeah, yeah,
that's a problem that's somewhere else.
yes, for
And
sure.
so what would it look like for us to try to, like, do we want to change our demographics? Do we
Yeah,
want to welcome people who aren't like us? And
yeah,
like that's question number one. And then if we
yeah, yeah,
do, then how do we do that? And what does that
yeah,
look like?
yeah.
One of the people Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, no, no. Go ahead. You're finishing up.
I
I
was
might take it somewhere else. So
just gonna say one of the people that I talk about at the end of the book, and it was so cool because I'm writing this book and I'm like, I don't know, where I'm going with this. I don't know where this ends. And right towards the end of my research and writing process, I got connected with a guy named Taylor Stewart who started a nonprofit called Oregon Remembrance Project. And he's Black, and his whole vision is like, how do we help Oregon become the opposite of what it began as? And
yeah,
like, how do we welcome people of color? How do we make this a place that works for people of color? And he's just like, he's so, he goes around to all these little towns of mostly white people all over Oregon and gets people to like do things, like
yeah,
he just started this thing. Grants Pass was a sundown town, and they
yeah,
started this project called Sunrise Town, and they started having Juneteenth celebrations and Martin Luther King celebrations, and you know what I mean? It's like
yeah,
people.
yeah,
He's somehow inspiring people to like white people to say, "Hey, we want to be something different than what we were before."
yeah,
So, like watching people like Taylor, I'm like, okay, this is possible. Like maybe it's not going to happen
yeah,
overnight. It's
yeah,
definitely not going to happen overnight. But there are steps that we can all take together to
yeah,
make our
yeah.
community look something different.
And I think the reason sometimes one thing that just popped in my head as you're telling me this is I think it's easy to get caught up in, well, we're never going to be able to convince everybody
Mm-hmm.
because there's always going to be this contingent of people who just flat
Yeah.
are the people that are openly against stuff like
Yeah.
this.
Yeah.
And I think about that and I think, well, it's just never going to happen. But I think, it's not really about that. It's about getting enough people who think of themselves as not racist to
Mm-hmm.
be active enough to say, no, we want this and we're willing to stand up for these people. We're
Yeah.
willing to come here. We're willing to protect them from, the people who don't maybe feel that way. And
Yeah.
I think it
Yeah.
really is, do we have enough people who say they want this to happen be willing to then go to the
Mm-hmm.
next step
Mm-hmm.
and not so much
Yeah.
are you convincing everybody that this
Yeah.
is an idea. So,
Yeah.
but yeah,
Although I will say the proudest thing, like my proudest moment for this book. I have a friend in Eastern Oregon who started a book club, and she invited people from her community. And then when they finished the book club, I hopped on Zoom and talked to them. And there was this man in that book club who said that he is conservative. He's always been conservative. And reading this book made him realize for the first time that maybe he should consume news sources other than conservative talk radio or talk TV or
yeah,
whatever. And I was like, that is like
yeah, yeah,
that is what I was hoping.
yeah,
So,
yeah,
even the people that we think can't change
yeah, for sure,
maybe can
for
change, but we
sure,
obviously
yeah,
let's start with the people who are
yeah,
ready.
yeah, yeah. It's interesting to think about. I think about that a lot when I like even the demographic, like in Vancouver,
Yeah.
we don't have a very large Black community, but we have a large Asian community and we have a
Mhm.
large Latino community. And I walk into a place of business and I think, okay, am I seeing, like, I know generally what the demographics of Vancouver are. Am I seeing that same demographic in this place?
Mhm.
And if not, why?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think that's honestly even one of the first questions that we can ask ourselves is
Mhm.
like,
Mhm.
there are places that we're going to and that we're spending our money at and that kind of thing. Are we seeing the range of people that are in our
Mhm.
community
Mhm.
already? Are they
Mhm.
being welcomed into these
Mhm.
places?
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
so that feels like one tiny little place to start of
Yeah.
just, okay, where are the places that people feel welcome? Let's
Yeah.
support those
Yeah.
places.
Yeah. Totally.
So, but yeah. Have you found ways as have you on your journey of addressing some of these issues like yourself, um, in a way that feels okay for you, that maybe you could share with other people as a place to start?
You asking like,
Like to address racism in the community. That was a
mhm.
very poorly worded question,
Yeah.
so I'm
No,
sorry
no, it
about that.
wasn't. No, it
But
wasn't poorly worded. I was just curious. Yeah, I just wanted to hear you say it again. Um, I mean, I think that right now, one of my primary callings is just to start having this conversation with people in
yeah,
ways like this, right?
right,
Like
right.
just let's just start talking about this.
Yeah,
Um, I am I have opened this conversation in my community, which I live in Gladstone, which is a small,
yeah,
mostly white, working class suburb of Portland, and there's a lot of racism here.
yeah, yeah,
Um, and so I've opened this conversation with my own community. Like, hey, do you guys want to do something? And the work is slow, but
yeah,
it's like just finding the people who want to do the work and figuring out like, okay, what's the next right step for
yeah,
us?
yeah,
So like one of the things is that here in Gladstone, we in 1922 there was a KKK initiation ceremony here in Gladstone. And so just asking the question, like, as a community, what are we going to do with that history?
yeah.
Um, and I don't know yet, but we've had a meeting and we have another meeting on the calendar. So, and I've talked to the mayor and I've talked to the city council. You know what I mean? So just like
Yeah, yeah,
I think one of the key things that I've learned through this whole process is that it's too big to think about like all the racism of everywhere
yeah,
in all time.
yeah, yeah,
But like, what's my history? What's the history of this town or this church or this family? And what would make sense for us to do next because of that?
yeah, yeah.
So, still very
I love that.
much,
Yeah, no, I love that because I think it along with a lot of the other things that we're all seeing in the news right now just feels so huge,
yeah.
and it's so easy to just get discouraged and feel
Hmm.
like I
Hmm.
doesn't matter what I do, I can't do
Yeah.
anything that's
Yeah.
going to make a big enough difference. But you just have to do the next thing.
Yeah.
You don't
Yeah.
have to. And I tell myself that all the time because I tend to get really discouraged about things. And
Hmm.
it's like, okay, back up the
Hmm.
truck,
Hmm.
back up the
Hmm.
anxiety train.
Hmm.
What can I do? What thing
Yeah.
can I actually physically do? Let's do that thing.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
and I think, there's conversations that have taken place over the last few years of, well, if you're going to be an activist, you have to go to protests, or you have to do this thing, or you
Mm-hmm.
have to do that thing, or else
Hmm.
you're not real. And I think that's the other thing that you have to consider is, who am I? What are my limitations? What are
Hmm.
my gifts? What are my challenges? Like what thing can I do?
Yeah.
But there's always something,
Yeah.
there's always something that we can do,
Yeah.
regardless of who we are and what our personalities are, what our tolerance levels are and stuff.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so,
One of the stories that it's not in the book because I learned it after the book was written, but I love this story. I don't know if you're familiar with the town of Waldport on the Oregon coast. It's like a tiny little
yeah,
town.
yeah, I am. Yeah,
Yeah, and they had a road called Darky Creek Road. And so they decided to learn what was the history, who was the person that this road was named after, how can we memorialize that person in a different way? So they changed the name of their road to the last name of the person who had lived there the road was named after. So now it's Southworth Road, and they commissioned a statue of Lewis Southworth and they put it in a prominent place in Waldport. And it's like those are just some simple
yeah,
things that only the people in Waldport could do,
right,
right? Just to
right,
find out like their own history and rewrite that story in a new way.
right. I
Yeah.
love that. That's actually a
Yeah.
perfect place for us to
Yeah.
end the main conversation. But I always like to finish up by asking, like, are there projects that you're working on now? Are there new books in the future that we need to watch out for?
I hope so. I feel like I'm throwing noodles at the wall right now and seeing what
Yeah,
sticks. Like I
understandable.
have started a couple different introductions to books.
Yeah.
Um, I started working on a middle grade novel just for fun, but
Yay.
yeah, I
Yeah.
don't really know what's next, but
That's
hopefully
okay.
something.
That's okay.
Yeah.
And sometimes people can't talk about it because it's under contract, but it's not like public yet. And so
Yeah,
no, we
yeah.
totally get that. I was
Yeah.
just curious. I think the interesting thing is that people might not know is that when you're a nonfiction writer, you usually end up writing a book proposal. I don't know if you did
Hmm.
that for this one.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
it looks a little different. Our process looks a little different. Also a nonfiction writer.
Mm.
So it looks a little different from we're writing the book or you're writing the first few chapters and you're querying with agents and then
Yeah.
then you're hopefully out on submission and stuff. With a nonfiction, you're generally putting together the chapters and a sample
Hmm.
chapter and comp titles and a whole proposal. And so it looks,
Hmm.
it's like it is kind of throwing spaghetti against the wall, trying to figure out, okay,
Right.
what's going to actually work out next. But
Right.
that's very exciting though.
Yeah,
Well,
thanks.
I really, really appreciate you sitting down and having this conversation tonight. I love to get the conversation going about this kind of stuff because I think that that's the first step.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
hopefully people listening will take that next step after that. To that end, are you aware of, this might not apply to Vancouver people, but perhaps if people are listening in the Portland area, different organizations that people might tap into who are doing work that they might be able to get involved with?
Um, so Taylor Stewart, Oregon Remembrance Project is always ready to
Okay.
come work with communities. I don't know about in Washington as much. There are a number of different organizations. Oregon Black Pioneers was super helpful to me. Um, I can tell you which organizations are receiving donations. Right here in the Red Door Project is a really cool project that people can go find out what they do and support them. And the Native American Youth and Family Center of Portland is also receiving some money from this book. So, yeah.
Okay. And I will put all of these, Native American Family Center. What was the rest of that?
Family and Youth Center of Portland.
Okay. I will put all of these in the description of the video.
Well,
And just so people know too, there are two current bookstores that I'm aware of and one coming bookstore that I'm aware of. Black-owned bookstores. There's Third Eye Books in Portland. Uh, and I have not gotten down there yet. It's like on my list of things to do, but I know that I like repost their stuff
mhm.
sometimes on our Instagram page. So they're great. And then there is a brand new romance bookshop in
Yes.
Vancouver that just opened up last fall called A Romance Era. And if you look her up online, you can find her hours because I know that they're like evening and weekends are her most common hours. So definitely look that up ahead of time before you go. But she's great too, and we're super excited to have her in the book community in Vancouver. And I hear rumors that there's another Black-owned romance
Yes.
bookstore coming in Portland too, but I don't think she's open yet. Uh,
Catherine Morgan. I have been mutuals with Catherine Morgan on Twitter for
oh,
years.
yay!
And then
That's
when she was
awesome.
working at Powell's, when my book came out, she got to do the introduction. I did a little book lunch at Powell's and she introduced me, so I got to meet her in
Oh,
person.
that's very
And
cool.
yeah, she's doing a romance bookstore, so very
Is she
exciting.
a Catherine with a K or a C? Do
She
you
is a
know?
Catherine with a K.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that one's super cool too. So if you're book people, which if you found your way to this interview, you probably are, that is one way that you can make a small like contribution to the community, is to Third Eye Books in Portland, a Romance Era bookshop in Vancouver, And then I will look up and try to see if I can find out more information about Catherine's store and see
Yeah.
if there's anything online about when she's going to open. So we can do that too. So
You're like the Santa in Miracle on 34th Street, telling people to go buy their books in other bookstores. That's so great.
yeah. Well, I just, I don't know. I feel strongly, but I talked to Becky too, and I think she would agree. She's the owner of
Mhm.
Vintage and it's been her store for 49 years. And so, um, we're a big community. We're a big book
Mhm.
community, Vancouver, the greater Portland area. We got plenty of room for more than one store. So
Yep,
it's good to have other book people around to hang out with. So
that's right. We got to keep books alive.
exactly, exactly. Well,
Yeah.
I remember this is completely side note, but when I first moved down here way back in 1994, I worked for the library for a few months, and I know the Vancouver Community Library was very proud of the fact that they were actually busier than the Seattle Public Library as far as how
Oh,
many books were going in and out.
that is cool.
Um, so yeah, I mean, we're book people. We can
Huh.
support more than one bookstore. So
Yeah,
we
yeah.
like all these people coming in. So yeah. Anyway, thank you so much. I hope you have a good night, and do come in if you're interested in the book. We have a copy in the store, and we can always order more if we need to. We would love to have that problem. So
Yay. Sounds
thank
good.
you
Thank you
so
so
much.
much. This has been a
Have
great
a